Recording.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone to another Artist Loft 101 drawing class. I'm your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and I'm joining you from Austin, Texas, where I teach and make work, and in my studio space now where I make and sell my personal work. And yeah, I've been teaching art to all ages for the past 12 years, specifically adults for the longest. And so I'm very experienced with teaching a variety of learners because I know that we have all ages joining us here. And this is actually a repeat of a class that we already had last Wednesday, on drawing drapery. So if you already attended that class, or even if you've seen it on YouTube, stick around because every time I teach the same subjects, I always change a little bit. No class is ever exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to my tabletop view here. Oh. And as Kelly said, any work that you make in class tonight, or if you're watching this on YouTube later, feel free to tag your work on social media with Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes, and you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art, and you can even tag me in your artwork. I love to see it. And if you're interested in signing up for any independent classes that I have coming up, or just seeing what else I have going on, you can check out my link tree. So if you just Google link tree and Adrienne Hodge, it should come up pretty easily. Or there is the link as well. I realize sometimes we drop things in the chat, but then those viewers who are watching on YouTube later wouldn't get to see the link. So there's that. And here's some of my personal work that I do using primarily calligraphy ink on paper. So I work in a variety of water media, but mostly ink, but I do a lot of watercolor, gouache, mixed media, collage, and there's all of my information if you want to find me on the internet. Okay, so in tonight's class, we're talking about developing value drawing skills, and specifically drawing drapery. So this class is labeled for intermediate artists, but again, you know, stick around. If you feel like that's not you, you still will take away something from the class. But I will be not skipping over completely a lot of topics, but I might not go in depth as much as I would on certain subject matter in regards to drawing drapery as I would if this was an absolute beginner class. But here is what we will talk about tonight. So simple ways to break down the subject of drapery drawing, how to set up your own drapery still life, a trick for achieving convincing texture, how to apply contour lines and value shapes to drapery drawing, the advantages of using toned paper, and how the use of negative space and implied line can elevate your drapery drawing. So if I haven't covered one of those topics by the end of the class, well, I don't know why I started to say that. I will be covering all of those topics by the end of class, but if you miss something, you can always go back and watch the recording on YouTube tomorrow. Okay, so the supplies that I'll be using tonight are toned paper, everything that was on the supply list. So there was a link to the toned paper that I'm using, the Artist Loft brand sketching pencils. I've got the set of 12. You might also use that Artist Loft 101 kit that comes with some charcoal pencils. So we're going to use some charcoal pencils. And I had a link to the charcoal set because that specifically has the white pencil on it. And you're going to want the white pencil for toned paper. You're going to want an eraser, either synthetic or kneaded eraser, and then some blending stumps or tortillions. So any questions about supplies before I get started, I'm going to let Kelly moderate all the comments and questions, but do we have anything jumping out about supplies so far, Kelly?
Right now we have one question. If you can use normal pencils if they do not have charcoal.
Yeah, you can definitely stick to just graphite on blank white paper tonight, even if you don't have the toned paper, but I'm going to be using the toned paper. So some of what I'm doing with specifically just using the white on the toned paper won't apply to you. So you'll just have to account for that. And then, but if there's no other questions about supplies, I'm going to move on to talking about how to set up a drapery still life for yourself.
Okay, there's no other questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so to set up your own drapery still life, you're going to need just a piece of fabric. I suggest getting a piece of fabric that doesn't have any patterns on it. So a pillowcase, a sheet, tablecloth, pillowcase or a sheet's probably the easiest thing to grab. I've been known to pull a curtain down off the wall before because I liked the texture of that fabric for a drapery still life. I'm actually using a woman's slip just because I liked the texture of the slip. And then I've got a stack of books here. So underneath my drapery, I've just placed a stack of books, and then I just placed my drapery on top of the stack of books so that it sort of cascades down the stack of books. And that way you'll have just some interesting folds happening to the way that the drapery falls. So I'll give you guys a moment to set that up. And then the last, I see a lot of people setting up their own still lifes, and that's awesome. And then the last thing you're going to want is to make sure you have a strong light source. So you might already have a lamp nearby that's giving you some strong light and dark shadows, some highlights and shadows on your drapery. If you don't, if you don't have a very dramatic light source, then you might grab a lamp or move it closer. I want to move my lamp closer, but I've had so many issues with my lamp in my studio overheating my phone in these classes. So I've had to just keep it over there, even though it's a nice dramatic light. But you should move your light as close to your drapery as possible so that you can get a nice, strong, dramatic light falling across it. And honestly, if you can't find a blank, a no patterned piece of fabric, or if your fabric has like stitching that you feel like is distracting somehow or imitates a pattern, I think the stitching can be really helpful to finding contour lines. And sometimes I even think a pattern can help, but most people get people tend to think both ways. I've had students who will say they think the fabric pattern makes it easier, and people who say that they think the pattern is too distracting and overwhelms them. So it's kind of your choice on that. If you feel like a patterned fabric would actually benefit you, then by all means use that. Okay, so we've set up our drapery still life. So I don't expect that we will all have an example by the end of class that looks exactly like this. It really depends on where you are in your art practice. If I could even complete like one area of a drapery fold that is nice and developed, then I would call it a success, where I'm suggesting drapery to anybody who looks at my drawing. They look at it and they think, yeah, that's a pile of fabric. Then you've achieved what you came to achieve. But I definitely encourage you to keep drawing after the hour is up, because the hour does go by fast, but I'm going to definitely hit all those points that I talked about. And I may refer back to this example depending on how far I get on my drawing. Before we get started actually drawing, or before I get started actually drawing my still life here, there's one more thing I want you to grab, and that's just a piece of scratch paper and I just want to talk really quickly about the anatomy of drapery, or those simple ways of breaking down the subject matter of drapery. And so yeah, and I am just going to be using any pencil for this scratch practice, but I would suggest a heavy B pencil so that you can get some really soft fluid movements going. Okay, so first of all, before we get started, I want you to think about, like, just look at your drapery or look at my drapery. This is all about observation right now, just breaking down the drapery and this scratch paper activity. I want you to really just observe and look closely at the drapery, because all art really comes to observation, right? So look at it and tell me, what adjectives would you use to describe the drapery? Give me some adjectives that describe the drapery, or specifically the texture of the drapery.
So we have some responses coming in. Would you like me to read them out loud?
Yes, please.
So we have smooth, flowing, flowy, wrinkle, soft, light, silky. We have a lot, by the way. Sorry. So sparkly.
Okay.
Just let me know when you have enough.
All right, well, there's two words I haven't heard yet that I just really like, and I kind of said one a minute ago. It's fluid. Maybe somebody said that, but I love to think of it as being a fluid thing. And then the other one is billowy, and maybe somebody said that, but Kelly didn't read it out loud. Okay, but these are all great adjectives. Any adjectives that you guys said, there's no wrong answer here. I just want to get you, really, when you draw any type of subject matter, any texture, you can do this. This is my little trick for achieving convincing texture, because when we get into like the kind of anatomy or bones of the drapery here in just a second, there's one other subject matter that I feel like imitates the same kind of structure that the drapery tends to fall in, and that's a pile of rocks. You know, if I'm looking at a pile of rocks, I might easily have the same sorts of like shapes that I'm seeing on the drapery. But the difference between a pile of rocks and drapery is that a pile of rocks is not necessarily smooth and flowy and fluid and silky and billowy, right? It might have these sharp edges, but it's going to be jagged, it's going to be hard, it's going to be, you know, all the contours that we would use to represent that pile of rocks are going to imitate the surface of the rock, which is hard and jagged and rough, and you know that texture is going to come across by using lines that are hard and jagged and rough and that sort of thing, right? So if we're trying to make something look smooth and fluid and billowy, then we need to use lines that are fluid and soft and billowy. So I want you to just do some figure 8 sketching right now to just loosen up and get your lines, you know, to be fluid and light and flowy. You know, do it as much as you want, even if you just kind of do some loopy scribble action. We're making sure that our lines are imitating the texture that we're trying to create. And I think that goes a really long way, because the more I break down the structure of the drapery, you'll see what I mean about how it can follow the same patterns that we might see in a pile of rocks, which is the opposite texture, right? Okay, so there have been lots of artists who have found little code ways of dissecting the anatomy of the drapery, and the ones that I love are the repetition of a couple of different three-dimensional shapes or forms, sorry, and that is cylinder shapes. So we might have a drapery fold that falls like a long cylinder or a thick cylinder. So that means it's going to have an horizontal axis that curves, but then a vertical axis that is straight or maybe curves slightly, but overall it feels like a cylinder. And then we're going to have cones. So something that looks like a triangle, but is rounded. So the vertical axis may kind of radiate out like this, and then the horizontal axis might curve out like this, but then you're going to have some cones that are not curved out, but they're curved in. So the horizontal axis is still curved, but it's curving inward versus outward. And then throughout all of those folds, we're going to have these little wrinkles on top of them that are like little cones or little cylinders, or maybe like a little bowl shape or a cereal shape, like a cereal bowl shape. And so it might curve in or out like this, depending on what's happening on that wrinkle. So the entire fold may be curving one way, but the wrinkle might be curved a different way. So as you start to observe your drapery, notice where you're seeing some three-dimensional forms that feel like a cone shape or that feel like a cylinder shape. And once we start stacking those on top of each other, it starts to feel like drapery. So the biggest thing about drapery that tends to put people off is that we don't really have a stock image in our minds for what drapery looks like. For a number of other subject matter that we may be drawing, you tend to have these stock images in your brain of what that thing looks like. Like if I asked you to draw a bird right now without looking at a bird, you could probably draw a bird without looking, right? You can think about what the shape is of the beak, what the shape is of the eyes, the overall shape of the bird, its feet, etc. But, you know, and I could say draw a house or draw a car, you know, and you can come up with something from this imagination that you, these, you know, beautiful imaginations that we all have and these stock images for certain things. But if I asked you to draw drapery without looking at drapery, you're likely to struggle because there's no stock image in our brain to like lean up against, right? So these shapes here can be something to kind of lean on. But if we were to just start drawing a series of cones and cylinders without really observing our particular drapery, we might get lost because it's just really easy to get lost in all those folds, right? So another trick that I like to do to kind of map out the drapery as I'm drawing it is really notice specifically the prominent folds or shadows that are occurring on like one specific part of the drapery. And another mistake that I see people make when they're drawing drapery is getting easily overwhelmed trying to draw the entire drapery at once and not breaking it down to these little moments and focusing all of their attention on just one specific moment, because this drawing is not super developed. Like I didn't develop every area of this drapery, but when you look at it, it looks like drapery because I really focused my attention on like this fold, and this fold that I was seeing. And by doing that, your eye, the viewer's eye, completes the image, right? You see this information and you read it as drapery. So you read even some of these other moments that might be, you know, if the drawing was just this, it might be confusing what I was looking at. Like if I zoom in on that underdeveloped part of the drawing, it's not necessarily screaming drapery at me, right? So as you're starting to draw it, don't get impatient with yourself if you haven't really focused your attention on one specific area. So if you're trying to draw the whole thing and you're giving every aspect of the drapery equal amounts of attention, then it's likely that you could stall out and get bored because it's not happening. But if you focus all of your attention on just one or two prominent folds and keep developing the value in that area. So the light and dark that you're seeing in that area, you're going to be much better off. Okay, and that's where the benefits of the toned paper come in, because the mid-tones are already there for us and we can really just jump back and forth between the highlights and the shadows. So the last little trick that I wanted to say was I like to name the caves. So this is kind of dorky, but also like I'll call them like the cave of, let's see, what are some names of some folks in the class? The cave of Shirley, or the cave of Richard. And so as I'm drawing, I'm like, okay, I've got the cave of Shirley and the cave of Richard, and where is everything else in reference to those specific caves or deep shadows, deep recesses that I'm seeing in my folds, and come back to those again and again. And then the last, I keep saying it's the last thing, but this is really the last thing I want to point out. And I want you guys to answer this question. And it's a very easy question, but for some reason it always stumps people and I get crickets in the room when I ask it. And it's just about getting you to look and observe the drapery. But why do we have the lightest light, the lightest highlighted area next to our darkest shadows on the drapery? Why does that happen?
So we have a couple answers coming in. Contrast was listed 3 times to show depth. Reflective light.
That's not quite what I'm looking for. It's even more simple. It's a really obvious answer. Like literally, why is the brightest highlight next to the darkest shadow? I just want you to.
Or
yes, the light is falling there. I feel like I saw somebody maybe say it.
yeah, sorry, they come in so quickly.
I saw someone type it. It was where the fold is. It's basically just the elevation of the fold, which sounds like another like sci-fi fantasy title, like the cave of I had a lady in a class named Dawn once, and I was like, the cave of Dawn, and that was like the most epic cave name I ever gave a drapery fold. But yeah, specifically just the nature of the drapery is that the elevation is higher where the light is hitting it directly. So that means you're gonna have a recess next to a highlight, right? You're gonna have light falling at the edge of that cave, but you're not gonna have light inside of the cave because of the elevation there, right? It's recessed. And so, but by the nature of it being recessed there, it's coming forward. So your lightest highlights are always gonna be next to your darkest shadows. So that's just another way to kind of get your bearings and find where you are and map out the drapery and like not get lost, because you have this understanding of, okay, I've gotten a little lost. Where am I in this drawing? Well, I'm always going to have a really strong highlight next to my darkest shadow. All right, I feel like that's always a lot at the front end of a class like this, but it always feels really important to say all that stuff. So I'm going to get started drawing with I recommend you start with an H pencil, just so that if you make any mistakes early on as you're mapping out your drapery, you can easily erase your lines. So you want to start out nice and light with your sketching so that you can erase any lines here, because I think it's important, specifically with drapery, to try to get your folds mapped out as accurately as possible. Anytime I say that and then I don't follow that advice myself, I feel it. If I don't map it out as accurately as possible as I'm starting to draw it, I will get lost, and it's harder to render what I'm imagining versus what I'm actually looking at. And when it comes to a lot of other subject matter, I tend to say, you know, like with organic things like clouds and trees, it doesn't have to look like that cloud. It just has to look like a cloud. And yes, it doesn't have to look specifically like this drapery, but you're doing it more for yourself. You're doing it so that you don't get lost. So the more accurately you map out you know, just the distances between certain folds in your sketch, the better off you're going to be. So I'm just going to hold that up a little closer. I'm just mapping out my original lines, and I know it's hard to see what I've done so far, but I'll get further in my drawing for you guys if I do it this way. So I'm not focusing my attention on everything I'm mapping out here. Oh, I just made a corner happen somewhere. So this is here, this, and then this. I'm not going to necessarily develop my value on the entire sketch. I'm just kind of mapping everything out, but I'm going to focus all of my attention on these two folds right here. But I also want to map out any prominent wrinkles that I'm seeing. You could even give those names if you wanted. But as you're doing this, you're probably noticing how easily this could be, you know, a mountain range or a pile of rocks, like I said before. So the difference is how soft we're making our lines. So in this initial sketch, you can, you know, kind of map things out with some jagged lines, but as we start to develop it further, we want to really keep our value nice and soft. Okay, I think that's good enough. So I'm going to start with my white pencil and not my shadows, just because I think it's important to give the light attention. We always tend to focus on the shadows when we're drawing, and shadows are important, but the light is equally important. It's not less important than the shadows for sure. Sometimes in certain drawings, it can be the thing that really makes it. So always pay attention to your highlights. And if you're drawing with just pencils on white paper, then you're going to have to make sure that your value is staying blank in places where you have your absolute highlights. So that's just my little tonal shading value scale from another class. So if we're talking about our absolute white highlights, we want to leave that blank paper if you don't have the toned paper. But if you have the toned paper, then you can use your white for that. And then your darkest shadows are going to be your absolute 10 on the value scale. And if this is the first class in this series that you have attended, there are several classes on just value. There's an entire class on tonal shading. There's an entire class or two classes that break down hatching and cross hatching, and then stippling and scribbling. And you can find those on YouTube, or if Kelly has them handy, she can drop them in the chat for you, so you can find those later. But I'm going to go ahead and just sketch in all my brightest highlights with my white. And I'm going to try to keep my lines curving, suggesting this billowy, fluid landscape that I'm seeing here. And if it's helpful to do those contour line sketchings like I was doing in the preliminary sketching phase here, that can also be really helpful, but you just want to keep those lines pretty light if you do it that way. So if you kind of go ahead and sketch in your contours like this to suggest to yourself that all of the white highlighted value that you add here needs to curve upward on that particular fold, or be flat on this wrinkle, or curve down right here, that can really help you those elevational lines. And you could even follow the stitching or the pattern that you're seeing in your drapery. But you just have to be careful that if you're putting those contour lines in there like that, that you're not making them too you're not making them suggest a surface of a different kind of texture. So sometimes when we put those in, it can really start to feel more like a mountain range. So you just want to make sure that when you go back in and start to blend your white highlights in those moments, or your shadows in those moments where you've done that, that you're keeping it smooth. And that's where the Tortillions or the blending stumps can be really helpful. And that when you're using the Tortillions, sometimes it's nice to start out with the smaller ones first, because the big ones can really blend things around in a way really quickly sometimes, maybe a little too quickly. And this takes some time, you guys. It's very difficult to quickly render drapery. It definitely takes some various layers and lots of blending. And the more you're suggesting a surface that sort of undulates and goes up and down and curves and is fluid, the more successful you're going to be with it. So don't give up. I like to always say that when you're drawing drapery, it's almost like you're painting, because anytime you have multiple layers of something and lots of blending, you've essentially got a painting. And that's what you're doing when you're drawing drapery. And most paintings tend to go through what I like to call a teenager phase, where it feels like it's super awkward. It's never going to work out. It's always just going to be a disaster. But when you just keep going and persevere, you usually come out of those teenage years much stronger, right? So same thing with your drapery drawing. Just stick with it and keep going and keep looking and observing and building up layers. And I promise you it will come out of the awkwardness that it might be in any of the early stages. Like mine is still feeling pretty awkward to me here so far. And sometimes even by the end of a demo, I'm still struggling to get mine to come out of its teenager phase. So it's never as easy as it may look. Although I don't think anybody in this class thinks that drawing drapery is easy. Maybe you do. Okay, I'm gonna jump to some of my B pencils now. I'm gonna go ahead and put in some of the darkest shadows that I'm seeing. So I've got my 6B, and I'm gonna exaggerate my shadows because the way that the light is, I wanna move that lamp closer so that I get some like really deep shadows to happen here. But I just don't have any shadows that I would say go to an absolute 10 on the value scale. In this drapery still life, I had a spotlight pointed directly at this drapery, and those shadows did get that dark. So I didn't have to exaggerate the shadows there, but I am going to exaggerate some of my shadows here just to create contrast. So that very severe dark and light happening. So this is where I'm seeing it get the darkest, but I don't see very much of that shadow. You may be facing your shadow directly where you're really seeing into the cavernous dark space there. But I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the white here, where I kind of sketch in my contours and suggest to myself which direction my value is going to follow in various folds, but just being mindful of my pressure on my pencil as I do that, so that I don't make any lines that are too hard to cover up or erase if they get too dark. And also, if I sketch those contours too dark onto the paper, it can start to feel like I'm suggesting a texture that's more like a mountain range, right? So that's the other reason not to put too much pressure on your pencil as you're adding those contours. But it's more just a guide for myself so I know how to add the value. Because if I just fill that in solid, it's not going to be as convincing as if I follow the contour lines. Okay, and one of the other points I wanted to make sure to hit was how to use negative space and implied line to your advantage. So I've had one class on implied line so far, and it definitely will come up again throughout this drawing series a lot, as it is right now. But I haven't had a class on just negative space yet. I'm planning one right now for probably November, sorry. But right now I have the negative space of this drapery can really help me to suggest drapery to my viewer. So in this drawing, I used the negative space at the top of the drapery here, the background, to really push the highlight of the drapery, that edge there. And so you can do the same thing. If you're working on blank paper with no, you're not using a toned paper, what you can do is leave it blank at the edge of the drapery where it kind of disappears into your background, and then just use, so I'm just going to kind of exaggerate a moment right here, like pretend that this is the edge of my drapery, even though it's not. I'm just going to make a little edge there. So if I just use straight lines right here to create a sense of depth in the negative space and like a background, I can push the drapery forward right there. So all I'm doing is just filling in that area of negative space where the drapery is not, with kind of a solid block of tonal shading. I started out with hatching, but then I smoothed it out to where it felt more continuous, like tonal shading. And what that can do is just push this forward. So if that were all that talk about how you should draw your drapery accurately, and then I'm imagining an edge here for myself, but I just want to make sure I talk about, because you're probably seeing a moment like this in your home drapery still lifes, where you've got that moment where the edge of the drapery meets the background or the negative space around it. So doing something like that can really push that edge forward for you. And that's something that I failed to mention in the last version of this class, or I think I did, but kind of briefly and didn't illustrate it. So that can be really helpful. And likewise, in any of these moments where the drapery is hitting the tabletop surface, you can have a really crisp edge there to where there may be a shadow falling on your table, and you can really push the value in that shadow. And I'm still just using a 6B here. And that'll push the space back as well and push the drapery forward right there. So use your negative space to really weight things down and further suggest to your viewer what they are looking at, so that they're not like, is that a pile of rocks? Okay. All right, so now I'm just kind of going back and forth and concentrating my attention to this one area. Really getting in there and looking closely and making sure that, you know, these little detailed moments where there's a fold over a fabric, that I'm making my lines follow that little curve that's happening where that fold is. I think this was my cave of Richard right here. And that's my cave of Shirley. Are there any questions up until now, Kelly, that are jumping out at you?
There's not many questions at the moment. Someone just asked what the kneaded eraser is for.
Oh, you just may prefer your kneaded eraser when you're using the charcoal, and I just realized, I'm glad you said that because I kind of forgot about my charcoal over here. So if you're struggling to get your, absolute darks to really stand out, you can jump to, the black of your charcoal. I guess I'm not thinking about it because I don't have any shadows in my particular still life that are extremely dark, but I did say I wanted to exaggerate them, so I'm gonna just exaggerate my darkest shadow here with my charcoal. And yeah, the kneaded eraser can sometimes pull out the charcoal easier than the synthetic eraser. I do have one really strong shadow right here that I would say goes to an absolute 10 on my value scale, so I'm going to really push that one, even though it's outside of my two folds that I wanted to concentrate on. This one has the darkest values, so I want to put it in there. It's where it's touching the table. And when it comes to blending with those tortillions, like I said, starting out really slow is good with like your smaller tortillion, because sometimes it can really, they can blend areas really quickly, and then you maybe will lose the subtle variation in light that you had there previously. So the tortillions are great, but I think it's good to not lean on them too much. When I use that white pencil, it always gives me like a little squeak when I try to get it nice and really bright. It's all about those details. So if you've attended the classes where I talked about still life items, so far I've talked a lot about, or really everything. The tree drawing class, I said the same thing. You want to try to capture the character that you're seeing of any subject that you're drawing. And it's those little details where that really comes across. So it may feel like editing out certain wrinkles isn't a big deal, but those paying really close attention to those little moments of wrinkles, I think really makes the drawing. So I'm going to really focus on one of the specific wrinkles that I'm seeing in mine right now, and I'm switching to an H pencil for some of my lighter values. And I'm just going to suggest the contours of that moment, that larger fold. And I want to get, I got a little lost in my drapery there. I think I am right here.
So Adrian, a couple questions are coming in.
Okay.
So we have a question regarding sharpening of pencils. So I'll read it. All attempts to sharpen my charcoal hard and white pencils results in the tip breaking off. Just bought this set today. What am I doing wrong?
Yeah, I've noticed that is an issue with the white pencil as well. So I like to use a utility knife or a blade to sharpen mine. And so I'll just give a quick tutorial on that. You can use any, just grab a cup to collect the loose shavings, and you can use any one-sided blade, an X-Acto knife, and what you're going to do is start at the far back on the pencil. Oops, I just threw some shavings on my drapery. I'll just imitate it here. So you're just going to kind of whittle the wood away until you've exposed the white, but don't cut into the white. So you're just cutting around the white until you expose it. And then you can use your sandpaper to sharpen it to more of a point. And if it loses its point while you're drawing, you can get the sandpaper back out. And sometimes when it's doing that kind of squeaky thing, it tells you, that you're losing your point too. And it's easier to achieve your lightest highlights when you've got it sharpened a certain way. So the one-sided blade is very helpful. And in the class on tonal shading with and without a ground, I do a whole 5-minute segment on sharpening your pencils like that with a blade. But I just prefer to sharpen all of my pencils that way because I get the most out of them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question, do you wipe off the tortillion after you use before going into another wrinkle?
No, I try to designate some tortillions for the wider values for the white pencil or the lighter values, and then other ones for the charcoal, because it's really hard to wipe them off until they're absolutely clean again. So, and also in case I forget to say it, some of these areas I'm going over with white and my graphite so that I can get kind of a medium gray to happen there. So I just wanted to point out that I'm doing that. And that's how you can get a subtle shift to happen from your white to your gray to your black, is let all three of them overlap. Yeah, there's that little squeaky sound again. Yeah, my biggest point that I want to make before the end of the class is just to keep going with this. You know, all art boils down to, all progress that we make in art boils down to the practice that we put into it. And if, you know, we're just giving it this 1 hour or, you know, just these 20 or 30 minutes that we've been drawing here, we're not likely to make as much progress as we would as if we keep going. So when the class is over, hopefully you will continue building up your layers on your drapery until they feel convincingly like drapery. And I think the moments where I've been the most successful so far are like that little detail that I just put in there was, I'm starting to get a lot looser with my application of some of my lines. So kind of taking a minute to like get some sketchy fluid lines to happen in yours is a good idea. Like your hand might not have been super warmed up at the beginning of your drawing to do this, but now that you've been drawing all these wrinkles and folds for a while, it might be easier to get some nice fluid movement to happen. So going back in and like outlining some of your highlighted moments with this. With a line that really moves and flows. You can really start to achieve that soft, undulating texture that we're looking for. It's really easy to, you know, focus on those details too much and neglect to put in those big flowy moments. And I've been using a lot of the same pencils. Let me get like a 4 or a 2B going here for a while. Get some different kinds of values to happen. And anywhere you're seeing like a really crisp, clean line in any of these folds, try to emphasize that. Those are the moments I think really stand out in the end. And if you have to kind of exaggerate them, that's fine too. It'll just add to the stylized quality of your work. I'm going back to my 6B now. But yeah, just because I'm switching my pencils doesn't mean if you're happy with using, you know, the same 2 or 3 pencils, or if you only have 2 or 3 pencils, don't worry about that. I'm just trying to make sure I get a variation in my value, but that can be achieved with just a shift in the pressure that you're putting on any pencil as well. And now that I've really built up the value in this area with my pencils, the Tortillion will blend that a lot easier than if I just tried to blend with just a little bit of. I think when you try to blend with just a little bit of value on the page, it ends up looking like you just smeared it around. Always have to be careful of that. I think think using the smaller tortillions first and then moving on to the big ones for a larger area of shadows is a good way to go. All right, so we're running low on time, so I'm gonna switch to my other example here and just finish up by pointing out, scoop my drapery out of the way and just talk about like what I did here to make this such a successful drawing. So like I said, I really pushed the background value here to push the value forward in the highlights. And I went over certain areas of folds. I gave those a lot of attention, have a strong contrast between dark and light happening here. I've got these big fluid moments and then small details, more concentrated moments, and making sure that my white highlights are nice and crisp and clean and stand out against the lighter highlights. And I also blended my graphite into my white in several areas here. And I also pushed my contours in a lot of these areas so that I knew where I was adding my value.
Hey, Adrian, quick question.
Yeah.
Teresa is asking for tips. She noticed the white charcoal is hard to get rid of once it is on. It's difficult to cover. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, that is an issue for sure. You can erase it off if you really work at it, but then sometimes you can take the top off of the surface of your paper when you do that. So I think it's better to just leave it alone and just, yeah, try to really build up like details around that moment. And I think those little happy accidents or quote unquote mistakes that happen when we're drawing, like putting on, you know, because the white in this scenario is a bit permanent, right? It's kind of like your darkest black charcoal. You can erase some of it out, but you're not likely to get all of it off the paper. So yeah, you kind of have to just live with it. In all of my classes that I've taught on pen and ink, and you know, I work primarily with ink in my personal work, I've really made the art of embracing mistakes my whole thing. Like I just let the materials guide me, and if those things happen, try to learn from them and keep going or see what I can do to improve, you know, areas around that moment so that it kind of takes the attention away from it. But sometimes when you make things like that happen and then you try to fix them, like it just creates more problems. So I think just living with it and working around it is the best way to go. Because I definitely had a moment like that right here in this drawing where I put the white on too thick and it kind of, I tried to go back over it with the gray to blend into it and it didn't quite work out the way I wanted to, and I'm willing to bet I can't fully erase that. Oh, actually, it is coming off somewhat there. But then when I go back over it, it's hard to get it because I've kind of taken the surface of the paper off a little bit in that area. So it's definitely a finicky medium to work with, but I think it's worth it for the results of how that white pops on the toned paper. All right, well, that is the end of our time. But yeah, if your drapery is not looking like drapery, just keep going, right? It's in its teenager phase and you just need to keep doing what you're doing and keep building up those layers and pushing your shadows, pushing your highlights until that starts to come to life. All right, well, thank you everyone for another great class, and I will be back next Wednesday for an encore of the tree drawing class. So the developing value skills class on drawing trees. We'll have a repeat of that one next Wednesday. And it'll be similar to tonight's class in that it will be a little bit different from the other tree drawing class. So tune in even if you saw the first one already. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Adrienne.
Thank you, Kelly. Have a great night.
Have a great one.